He had not spoken in 3 years. Not since the bullet that stole his ability to walk also stole every reason he had to try. Seo Jun-woo ruled his empire from a wheelchair now, cold and untouchable, feared by every criminal organization from Seoul to Busan. Then Nia walked through his door with her warm hands and her stubborn mouth and touched the shoulder he told everyone was dead to sensation. He felt it. Every single nerve ending screamed back to life. And the man who had decided he was already dead realized, with terrifying certainty, that he was not done yet. Please like, share, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Nia Ose needed the money. That was the only reason she stood in the marble lobby of the Seo estate at 7 in the morning, clutching her employment papers and reminding herself that a man's reputation was not the same as the man. The agency had warned her. Previous maids lasted an average of 11 days. The record was 4. The master of the house did not speak. He did not acknowledge. He sat by his window and looked out at the Han River like the rest of the world was a television program he had long since stopped watching. The housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Kwan, walked Nia through the rules with the speed and efficiency of someone who had given this speech many times and expected it to be the last. No eye contact unless he initiates it. No conversation unless he asks a direct question. No touching under any circumstances. Nia nodded at each rule. She had worked in difficult houses before. Difficult men before. She understood the language of grief dressed up as coldness. What she was not prepared for was the man himself. Seo Jun-woo sat in his wheelchair at the far end of the sitting room with the morning light cutting across his face like something from a painting that could not decide whether it was beautiful or devastating. He was 34 years old and looked both older and younger than that, older in the eyes, younger in the jaw, like a person who had stopped aging emotionally at the exact moment something inside him broke. He was dressed in all black with his hands folded in his lap and his gaze fixed on the river. He did not look up when Nia entered. She cleaned around him like he was a piece of furniture. That was the instruction. She dusted and straightened and refreshed the water on the side table, and she kept her eyes down, and she was almost out the door when she noticed the book on the floor beside his wheel. It must have fallen. She picked it up without thinking and set it on the arm of his chair, and her fingers brushed the back of his hand for less than a second. He went very still. Nia pulled her hand back immediately. She did not apologize because apologizing would have broken the no-speaking rule, and she had barely lasted 20 minutes before breaking the no-touching one. She kept her eyes down and left the room quickly and told herself the way the air in that room changed when she touched him was nothing. Just her imagination. Just the strange electricity that comes from a quiet house and a quiet man and too many rules. She had no idea that he had sat frozen in that chair for 11 minutes after she left, staring at the back of his hand like it had said something to him in a language he had forgotten he once spoke. The next day he was in the same spot. Same chair. Same river. Same silence. Nia worked around him again, and this time she was more careful, and this time she kept her hands to herself, and this time she still felt his eyes on her back every time she turned away from him. She tested it on the 3rd day. She turned around quickly, expecting to catch nothing. He was already looking at the river again, but there was something in the angle of his jaw that told her she had not been wrong. He had been watching. He had been watching her with the careful attention of a man who had stopped watching anything for a very long time. Nia was not naive enough to think that meant something good. Men like Seo Jun-woo did not develop feelings. They developed interests, and interests from men like him tended to be dangerous. She told herself this firmly every morning for 2 weeks. It stopped being convincing around day 9, which was the day she found him alone in the library at midnight. She had come back for her phone, which she had left charging behind the bookshelf in the east corridor. The house was dark and quiet and she was moving quickly, not wanting to disturb anything, when she saw the light under the library door. She should have ignored it. She opened it anyway. He was in there with a book open on his lap and a glass of something amber on the table beside him, and he was not reading. He was just sitting there in the dark with a single lamp casting half his face in shadow, and he looked so unbearably alone that Nia forgot every rule for approximately 4 seconds. "Are you all right?" she said, before she could stop herself. He turned to look at her, and it was the first time their eyes had fully met, and Nia felt it like a key turning in a lock she had not known was in her chest. His eyes were dark and exhausted and furious, and something else she did not have a word for. Something that looked like it was about to ask a question it had been holding for a very long time. He did not answer her. She left. But when she got home that night, she sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without turning on the lights. A few days later, the physical therapy started. Nia had not been hired for physical therapy. That was not in her contract. But the previous therapist had quit, and the replacement was delayed, and Mrs. Kwan had explained in a voice that left no room for argument that Mr. Seo required his morning stretches or the muscles in his back would suffer, and since Nia had a medical background from her previous work at a rehabilitation center, she was the most qualified person currently on the property. Nia had agreed because she needed the money and because Mrs. Kwan's tone had suggested that disagreeing was not truly an option. She had not expected it to feel like this. Physical therapy with Seo Junwoo meant getting close. Closer than the dusting allowed. It meant her hands on his arms and his shoulders and the back of his neck, guiding, supporting, checking range of motion with the careful professionalism she had learned in training. He was tense the first morning. She could feel every muscle guarding against her, braced the way a person braces when they expect pain. She worked slowly. She did not rush and did not push and narrated each movement before she made it the way she had been trained to do, because unexpected touch was different from anticipated touch, and she understood that better than most people. By the end of the first session he had not relaxed, exactly, but he had stopped bracing. That was enough. He still did not speak to her. But the silence between them was becoming something different. Less empty. More charged. The following morning he was already in the therapy room when she arrived. He had moved himself there from his bedroom, which Mrs. Kwan later told her in a low and slightly stunned voice was the first time in several months that he had made any effort before a session rather than having to be brought. Nia did not make a big thing of it. She just set up the table and said good morning and began where they had left off. But something had shifted and they both knew it and neither of them acknowledged it, and that not acknowledging became its own kind of intimacy. Later that week he spoke. Not much. Not dramatically. He said, "The angle is wrong," while she was positioning his left arm, and his voice came out rough from disuse and low and absolutely nothing like she had been bracing for. She adjusted the angle without looking up and said, "Better," and he made a sound that might have been agreement, and that was the whole conversation. That night she could not sleep. By the end of the second week, they were talking in small pieces. He would correct her if she used the wrong terminology. She would push back when he was being unhelpful. He told her once that she was stubborn. She told him that stubborn was another word for effective. He did not respond to that immediately, but she caught the corner of his mouth doing something that was not quite a smile. Almost a smile. The danger started on a Thursday. Nia had not been told anything about the nature of Mr. Seo's other business, the part that was not the pharmaceutical empire or the real estate holdings or the legitimate portfolio of companies that appeared in the financial press every quarter. She had not been told, but she was not unintelligent, and the men who came and went through the east entrance of the property at odd hours were not pharmaceutical consultants. On Thursday, a man she had not seen before walked into the therapy room without knocking. He was Korean, slightly older than Junwoo, with an expensive suit and the kind of smile that meant nothing good. He took one look at Nia's hands on Junwoo's shoulder and his expression shifted into something cold and sharp. He spoke in Korean, fast and dismissive, and even without understanding the words, Nia understood the tone. It was the tone of someone establishing that she was irrelevant. Junwoo's whole body went rigid under her hands. She felt it before she heard him respond, his voice dropping into something she had not heard before, quiet and absolutely final, the kind of voice that has stopped needing to be loud because everyone has already learned to be afraid of it. The man left. Junwoo sat very still for a moment. Then he said, in English, "His name is Beck Chael. He is my father's former business partner. You should avoid him." "That's the first complete sentence you've said to me," Nia said, before she could think better of it. He turned his head and looked at her. There was something in his expression that was close to surprised, like he had forgotten that other people noticed things. She went back to work. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. Beck Chael visited 3 more times over the next 10 days. Each time he passed through spaces where Nia was working, he would pause and look at her with that calculating smile, and each time she kept her eyes down and her face neutral and did not react, which was something she was quite good at when necessary. The third time, he spoke to her directly. His English was precise. He asked how long she had been working at the house. She answered briefly. He asked if she found the work satisfying. She said yes. He asked if Mr. Seo was difficult to care for. She looked up then, directly at him, which surprised him enough that his smile shifted slightly. "He is not difficult," she said. "He is healing." Beck Chael held her gaze for a moment, then made a sound that was not quite a laugh and walked away. And Nia stood there in the corridor and felt the particular cold that comes not from temperature but from the knowledge that someone has just decided you are worth paying attention to. She did not tell Junwoo about the conversation. She did not know why, except that something about it felt like information he would react to badly, and she was not ready for that particular explosion yet. The explosion came from a different direction. It came on a rainy Tuesday when one of the junior staff, a young man named Park from the security team, started finding reasons to be wherever Nia was. He was cheerful about it. Harmless, she believed. He brought her coffee once. He lingered in doorways when she was working. He laughed too easily at things she said and found excuses to show her things on his phone. Nia was politely tolerant and made sure to be professional and clear in every interaction. She did not encourage him. She did not have to. On the fourth day of this, she was in the main corridor outside the therapy room when Park appeared with coffee and a smile and a story about something funny that had happened in the security office. She was listening with half her attention and the other half on the door at the end of the corridor, which was the therapy room door, which was slightly open. She found out later, from Mrs. Kwan, who found out from someone else, that Jun-woo had wheeled himself to the doorway and watched the entire interaction without making a sound. That he had sat there for 4 full minutes before turning and going back to his position by the window. That when Mrs. Kwan had checked on him 20 minutes later, he had not moved and had not spoken, and the line of his jaw was, in her words, a little frightening. Nia did not find this out until later. What she noticed herself was that when she went in for the afternoon session, the atmosphere in the therapy room was different in a way she could not immediately name. Jun-woo was positioned at the window and he did not turn when she entered, which was new. "Good afternoon," she said. He did not respond. She set up the table and waited. When he did not move toward it, she said, "Are you ready?" He said, "You were talking to Park." It was not a question. Nia went still for a moment. Then she said, "Yes. He brought me coffee." The silence after that had weight. She could feel him deciding something, controlling something, pulling something back behind the wall where he kept the parts of himself that were not allowed to exist in professional spaces. He said, "You do not need to accept things from the staff." Nia turned around and looked at him directly. His jaw was set and his eyes were on the river and his hands were very still in his lap. She said, "That sounds like a personal preference dressed up as an instruction." He turned to look at her then. Something moved through his expression too quickly for her to fully read. She held his gaze and did not apologize and did not look away, and the air between them was several degrees warmer than it had any right to be. He turned back to the window. After a moment he said, "The session can begin." She worked through the session without mentioning it again. But she noticed that his focus was different that day. More present. Like he had decided to actually be in the room instead of only partly in it, and that decision had made him sharper and more there than she had ever felt him. When the session ended and she was packing up, he said, without looking at her, "I will speak to Mrs. Kwan about Park's assignments." Nia straightened up. She said, "That is not necessary." He said, "It is what I prefer." And the word prefer landed differently than instruction would have. It landed like something honest instead of something controlling, and she did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing and left, and he stayed at his window watching the river carry the last of the rain toward the sea. Park was reassigned to the east gate by the following morning. Nia noticed but did not comment. The first real conversation happened on a Sunday. Sundays the house was quieter. Most of the staff had reduced hours and the main rooms held a different kind of silence than the rest of the week. Nia was in the library returning books she had dusted and reorganizing a shelf that had been bothering her slightly off-center arrangement for days, and Jun-woo came in not for any apparent reason, just wheeled himself to his usual reading chair and settled there with his hands in his lap. She kept working. He watched her for a while. Then he said, "You reorganize by publication year rather than author name." She did not look up. "Yes," she said. "It tells a better story that way. You can see how ideas move across time instead of just who had them." Another silence. Then he said, "I used to read a great deal." She looked at him then. He was looking at the shelves with something that might have been grief or might have been hunger or might have been both at once. She thought about all the books that had piled up since his accident. All the mornings by the window instead. "What stopped you?" she said, though she suspected she knew. He said, "It required a kind of patience I lost for a while." She turned back to the shelf. She said, "It comes back. Patience does. Usually slowly and usually without you noticing until you realize you have been doing it again for some time." He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you have been doing the therapy exercises on your own in the evenings. Mrs. Kwan mentioned it. That requires patience. You did not have it 3 weeks ago." Another silence. This one felt different. Softer at the edges. He said, "You pay attention." She said, "It is my job." He said, "It is more than your job." She did not respond to that. But she was glad she was facing the shelf and not him, because she was not entirely sure what her face was doing. After that, Sundays became theirs. Not by arrangement, not by any spoken decision. Just a pattern that settled into place the way patterns do when two people stop fighting the direction they are naturally moving. She would come to the library on Sunday afternoons and he would be there, and they would talk or not talk, and both options were equally comfortable in a way that Nia had not experienced with many people. He told her things in pieces. About his father, who had built the CO empire from nothing and had trusted the wrong person. About the night of the shooting, which he did not describe in detail but referenced in the way people reference tragedies, obliquely and from the side, never looking directly at the center of it. About the year after, when he had decided that existing was something he would do minimally, only as much as the business required, nothing more. She told him things too, equally in pieces. About Lagos, where she had grown up, and her mother who was an emergency room nurse and had made sure Nia understood that the body was something you fought for. About the scholarship that brought her to Seoul and the 2 years she had spent at the rehabilitation center before the funding cut ended her position. About the particular loneliness of being in a foreign country and belonging fully to neither world. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and very few words. She had learned to understand that about him. That stillness was not distance. It was his version of presence. The shift happened on a Wednesday evening, 5 weeks in. Nia was in the corridor outside the East Wing, and she heard voices, raised voices, from behind the closed door of the study. One was Jun-woo's, cold and controlled but clearly warning something. The other was Beck Chael's, and even through the door his tone was clear, the tone of a man who has decided to stop pretending to be a guest and start acting like a creditor. She moved past the door quickly, because whatever was happening in there was not her business, and she had barely turned the corner when the study door opened and Beck Chael came out and stopped when he saw her. He said, "Still here." His smile was wrong in all the ways she had noticed before. He took a step toward her and said, "You know, you are quite wasted in a position like this." Nia said, "Thank you for your concern," and turned to keep walking. He said her name. She did not know how he knew it. The fact that he did made the skin on her arms go tight. She kept walking. She went to the supply room and closed the door and stood there for a moment with her hands very still and her breathing very even, the way her mother had taught her to stand inside a storm. She did not know that Jun-woo had come out of the study behind Beck Chael and had seen the end of that interaction from 10 feet away. She did not know that he had sat there watching her walk away and then turned back to Beck Chael with an expression that made the older man take a step back without quite knowing why. What she knew was that an hour later, Mrs. Kwan came to tell her that Mr. Seo was requesting she join him for dinner. Nia had never eaten with him before. The dining room felt different with 2 people in it, smaller somehow, more human. He was already there when she arrived, and there were 2 place settings, one at the head of the table and one directly to his right. Not across from each other, the way a formal dinner would be arranged. Close. She took her seat without commenting on it. He said, "Beck Chael will not be returning to this property." She said, "All right." He said, "If he approaches you outside this house, you will tell me immediately." She looked at him. He was looking at his plate, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that told her this was costing him something, this particular directness. She said, "Is there something I should know about the situation with him?" He said, "He believes he has leverage over the CO organization." He does not. He is attempting to create the impression of control by demonstrating access to things that matter to me. Things, Nia said carefully. He looked up at her then. His expression was not readable in the usual way, but there was something underneath it, something that had been building in the Sundays and the silences and the almost smiles. He said, "You should not be an instrument in someone else's strategy." She understood what he was saying. The understanding sat in her chest with unexpected weight. She said, "Is that what I am to you? A thing that matters?" The question hung there. He did not look away from her. He said, "Yes." Just that. One word. But the way he said it was without defense or qualification, the way he said things when he meant them completely. Nia looked at her plate. She said, "That is a complicated thing to hear." He said, "I imagine it is." They ate in silence after that, but it was the particular silence of 2 people who have just said something true to each other and are sitting with it carefully, neither wanting to disturb it. The following week, she found a package outside her staff quarters door. It was a book. First edition, judging by the cover, a collection of essays on the history of West African architecture. She had mentioned Lagos once, in passing, had said something about the way buildings there told the story of every era that had passed through them. She had not expected him to remember. There was no note. There did not need to be. She held the book for a long time before going inside. She did not thank him directly. The next morning during the session she said, "I started the book last night." He said nothing, but she felt his back lose approximately 3 degrees of tension under her hands, and that was its own kind of conversation. The crisis came on a night in late autumn. There had been tension for days. More closed doors, more visitors through the east entrance, more of the controlled silence that Nia was learning to recognize as Junwoo managing something serious. She worked around it and asked no questions and gave him the space that the situation seemed to require. On the third night of this, she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of movement in the corridor outside her room. She was a light sleeper. Her mother had made her one, living above a clinic for the first 12 years of her life. She got up and went to the door and opened it. Junwoo was in the corridor. He had wheeled himself there, which required navigating 2 turns from the east wing, and he was sitting very still with his head slightly bowed and his hands in his lap. He looked like a man who had come somewhere without entirely deciding to. She said his name, just that, quietly. He looked up. His face was, for once, unguarded. Whatever wall he usually maintained was down, and what was underneath it was exhaustion and something older than that, something that had been sitting with him for 3 years and had decided tonight to stop being quiet. She did not ask questions. She went to the small sitting room at the end of the corridor, the one with the low sofa and the lamp with the warm light, and she left the door open behind her. She heard him follow. She made tea. She had a small electric kettle in her room and she brought it out with 2 cups, and she sat on the sofa and waited while he positioned himself across from her, and then she poured for both of them and held out his cup and he took it. They sat there for a long time. He said, "Eventually, there are decisions I made before the accident that I am still managing the consequences of." She said, "Yes." He said, "Some of those consequences are coming to a head. There are men who believe that my current situation makes me a simpler problem than I used to be." She said, "And are they right?" He looked at her. He said, "No. But it requires a great deal of energy to prove that, and some nights that energy is harder to find." She said, "What does it feel like when you find it?" He thought about that. He said, "Like I remember why I built anything in the first place." She asked, "Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because my father built it and I watched him lose it and I wanted to prove it could be held. That what he created was worth protecting." She said, "And now?" He looked at her in the warm light. His voice when he spoke was quieter than she had heard it. He said, "Now I find myself wanting to protect different things." The room was very still. The city outside the window was its usual distant hum. Nia held her tea and felt the particular weight of a moment that was asking something of her, asking her to step toward it or step back, and she had not decided yet which direction was safer. She said, "That sounds like progress to me." His jaw shifted slightly. The almost smile. Then he said, "Does it frighten you?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "Yes. A little." He said, "Me too." That honesty settled between them like something solid, like ground under uncertain footing. She stayed until the tea was gone and then she said, "You should sleep." He agreed and turned back toward the east wing, and she watched him go and then sat in the small sitting room for a while longer, holding the warmth of the cup in her hands and thinking about the way he had looked at her when he said different things. The next day, the danger arrived in earnest. Nia was in the garden when the news reached the house. She could tell from the sudden shift in the energy of the security staff, the way conversations stopped and men moved with more purpose, that something had changed. Mrs. Kwan appeared at the garden entrance with her careful face on and said that Mr. Seo required the household to follow the Level 3 protocol, which meant everyone to their designated safe areas and no external communication without clearance. Nia went inside without asking questions. She went to her room as protocol required and waited. 40 minutes later, Junwoo's voice came through the internal communication system. Clear, calm, exactly himself. He said that a business situation was being managed and that there was no immediate threat to the household. He said that the staff were safe and would be informed when the protocols were lifted. He then said, specifically, Miss Osei should remain in the library. I would like to know she is comfortable. The library. His space. He was telling her where to be by naming the room that meant something. She went to the library and she sat in the reading chair by the window and she watched the sky go from gray to dark while the house worked around her, and she thought about the man 2 wings away who was managing a crisis he had not told her the details of and had still thought to make sure she was somewhere he considered safe. It was 3 hours before he came. He wheeled himself in and she looked up from the book she had found, not really reading but needing something to do with her hands, and he looked at her in that way he had developed, the way that was like a survey and a relief simultaneously, confirming that she was there and whole and exactly where he had placed her. He said, "It is resolved." She said, "Are you hurt?" He said, "No." She said, "The others?" He said, "There were injuries. None fatal. My response team handled it." She said, "All right." He moved to his chair. She did not go back to her book. They stayed in the library until it was late and the house had quieted back into its ordinary rhythms, and they talked about nothing important, which was itself a form of decompression that they had both developed without naming it. At some point she noticed that the lamp had made the room very warm and that his chair was closer to her than usual, close enough that if she reached out she could have touched his arm without stretching. She did not reach out. But she noticed. He noticed her noticing. He said, quietly, "Thank you for staying." She looked at him. She said, "Where would I go?" His eyes held hers for a moment with that something she had been watching build for weeks, closer now, less contained, not the almost smile but something more serious and more certain. He said, "I do not want you to go anywhere." She said, "Junwoo." He said, "I know. I am not asking anything of you tonight. I only wanted you to know." She held that. She said, "I know too." It was not a yes, and it was not a refusal, and it was not the conclusion of anything. It was two people who had been honest with each other about something true, and that was more than either of them had expected from this particular arrangement when it began. The conversation that changed everything came on a Sunday, a month later. She had been there for 9 weeks by then. The standard staff contracts were renewed every 3 months, and she had not thought much about the timeline until Mrs. Kwan mentioned it in passing, said that Mr. Seo had already signed the renewal papers for her contract and that she would receive the new terms by the end of the week. He had signed them without asking her. She sat with that for 2 days. It was presumptuous. It was also the act of a man who did not want to risk a conversation that might go wrong, who had handled it quietly and in the background the way he handled most things that mattered to him. On Sunday she went to the library and he was there and she said, "You renewed my contract without discussing it with me." He looked up from the book he was actually reading now, genuinely reading, which she had noticed and quietly been glad about. He said, "Yes." She said, "That was presumptuous." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He closed the book and set it down and looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which was always a great deal of weight. He said, "Because I did not want to have a conversation that ended with you leaving, so I made the decision unilaterally and planned to apologize for it afterward." She stared at him. She said, "That is remarkably honest." He said, "You have made it difficult for me to be anything else." She sat down. She said, "And if I had wanted to leave?" He said, "Then I would have had to accept that. But I preferred to try." He paused. "And I prefer you here. I have been clear about that." She said, "You have." He said, "Does that change anything for you?" She thought about 9 weeks of therapy rooms and library Sundays and a book that appeared outside her door and the way he had sent her to the library during a crisis because it was the room he considered safe. She thought about the corridors at 2 in the morning and the way he had said different things with the particular honesty of a man who had run out of reasons to pretend. She said, "It changes most things." He was very still. She said, "I did not come here expecting any of this. I want you to understand that. I was here for the work and the money and nothing else, and then you were there, every day, and I know what you are and I know this world and I know that it is complicated and I am not from here and you are who you are, and all of that is true." He said, "All of that is true." She said, "And I am still here." Something shifted in his expression. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. He said, "Nia." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have not wanted anything for 3 years. Not in the way people are supposed to want things, not personally, only professionally, only practically." He stopped. His hands were very still in his lap. He said, "And then you walked into the sitting room and picked up a book off the floor and touched my hand for less than a second." She said, "I remember." He said, "Everything I thought was dead came back at once. And it has not stopped since." The room was absolutely quiet. She said, "That sounds terrifying." He said, "It was. It is." His voice was low and certain. "But I find I prefer it to the alternative." She moved to the chair beside him, his actual chair, not the reading chair across the room. She sat close enough that she could see the particular gold in the lamplight on his face. She said, "What happens now?" He said, "I would like to understand what this is. What we are allowed to be." He met her eyes. "I am not in a position to pretend that the imbalance does not exist. You work in my house. I have authority over your employment. I understand if that makes this impossible." She said, "You signed my contract without asking me." He said, "I know." She said, "And I am not leaving." He said, "I know." She said, "So we understand each other." He said, "We have understood each other for some time." She reached out and put her hand over his, the same hands that had started all of this 9 weeks ago, and this time she was not picking up a fallen book and there was no accident about it at all. He turned his hand over and held hers. They stayed like that in the Sunday library with the lamp burning warm around them and the city quiet outside the window, and it was the most uncomplicated thing either of them had done in years. The weeks that followed were different in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. He smiled now. Not often, not loudly, but genuinely, with his whole face, and Mrs. Kwan saw it and went away to find something to do before she said anything she would have to explain later. He started coming out of the East Wing more often, appearing in rooms where Nia was working, not to interrupt and not to demand anything, just to be in the same space. He started working with a new physical therapist, an actual one, a specialist from the CO group's medical wing who came twice a week with equipment and structured protocols. But he still did his Sunday morning routine with Nia. She did not ask him why. She knew. Those sessions were not about the therapy anymore. They were about the particular closeness that they had built in that room, her hands knowing his body's landscape by now, the way he breathed differently under her hands than under anyone else's, the way the room held a particular quiet that belonged only to them. The specialist noticed. She was professional about it and said nothing, but Nia caught the small nod of recognition in her expression, the nod of someone who understands that some healing happens in the body and some happens somewhere else entirely. The danger that had been building in the background came to a head on a night in early winter. Nia was woken at midnight by Mrs. Kwan, who came to her door looking less composed than she had ever seen her and said that there had been a serious breach in the security of the CO organization's information systems, and that certain documents had been leaked to individuals who would use them to pressure the company publicly, and that the source of the leak had been traced back to someone inside the household. Nia sat up in bed. She said, "Who?" Mrs. Kwan said, "We do not yet know. But Mr. CO is asking everyone to remain in their rooms while the security team conducts a review." She added, "And he has asked specifically to speak with you." Nia went to the study. Jun-woo was there with two of his most senior people and a laptop open on the desk showing what appeared to be surveillance logs. He looked up when she came in, and there was something in his expression that was not accusation but was not entirely absent of it either. He was being careful, thorough. He was a man who had been betrayed before and had learned what it cost. He said, "I have to ask you some questions." She said, "I know." He said, "I need you to understand this is protocol. It applies to everyone." She said, "I understand." He asked the questions. When she had last used the external communication systems, whether she had ever accessed the document server, whether anyone outside the property had contacted her recently. She answered all of them fully and without defensiveness, because she had nothing to hide and because she understood that this was what integrity in difficult situations required. He watched her through all of it with his careful eyes. When it was done, he said to his team in Korean, "Leave us." They left. He and Nia were alone in the study. He said, "I want to apologize." She said, "You were doing your job." He said, "I was. But I know you, and I allowed the process to feel like doubt, and it was not. I know who you are." She said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes." He said it with the same certainty with which he said most true things. Then he said, the source was not in the main household. It was a planted vulnerability in a system that Beck Chael had access to. He was using it as leverage, the same strategy he has been attempting for months. She said, "And now?" He said, "It has been handled. He will not have access to anything that belongs to me again." She heard the weight of that word. Belongs. She said, "What did it cost you?" He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Less than losing it would have." She knew he was not talking only about the documents. She crossed the room and stood beside his chair, and he looked up at her with that expression she had spent 9 weeks learning to read, the one that was all the things he had spent 3 years believing he was not allowed to feel anymore, and she put her hand on the side of his face very gently. He closed his eyes. She said, "You are not managing this alone anymore." He said, against his better judgment and after a careful pause, "No. I do not believe I am." That winter moved toward something that felt like arrival rather than ending. He began taking meals with her regularly, not just special occasions. She began keeping a few of her books in the library without asking if it was all right, and he never mentioned it, which was itself permission. He started showing her the parts of the CO organization that were legitimate and good, the medical research programs and the community housing projects, the parts his father had built before the cracks in the foundation appeared. She started learning Korean. Not seriously yet, not in any structured way. But she would ask him words, and he would tell her, and she would use them incorrectly, and he would correct her with a particular patience that was very different from his usual precision, patient in the way you are patient with things you do not want to rush. She said the word for difficult one morning, used it in the wrong context, and he said, That is not what that means, with the ghost of the smile that had become familiar enough now that she recognized it even when it was small. She said, I know. I said it on purpose. He looked at her. He said, why? She said, because you smile when I get things wrong. Something passed across his face, warm and completely undefended. He said, I smile when you do anything. The words sat between them simply and honestly. She said, that's either very sweet or very alarming. He said, probably both. On a Thursday in midwinter, she arrived at the therapy room for the morning session and found him standing. Upright, with his hands on the bars of the parallel rails his specialist had installed, bearing his own weight on legs that had been told for 3 years they were finished with that particular work. He was shaking slightly with the effort. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they found hers, were fierce with something she recognized as the expression of a person who has decided to do something not for themselves. She stood in the doorway and did not move, because she understood instinctively that the wrong response to this moment could ruin it. He said, I have been practicing. The specialist has been working on nerve regeneration. It is partial, not complete. I cannot walk without the rails yet, and it may be some time before I can without assistance, if at all. But this is what I can do today. She said, I see that. He said, I wanted you to see it. She said, Junwoo. He said, I am not telling you this changes anything about what I am or who I am. I am still the same person in the same situation with the same complications. I know that. He held her gaze with a steady certainty that was so specifically him. But I wanted you to know that I am trying. That I am choosing to try. And that you are the reason I am making that choice. Nia walked across the room. She stopped in front of him, close enough that his effort to stay upright brought him to her height almost, close enough that she could feel the exertion radiating from him, and she put her hand over his on the bar. He exhaled, like he had been holding that breath for a very long time. She said, I am not going anywhere. He said, I know. She said, but I want you to be sure that you are doing this for yourself. Not for me. He said, I am doing it because you reminded me that I had reasons. He steadied himself. But also yes, for you. For what I want for us. She said, what do you want? He said it simply. He said, everything. A life. You in it. She stood in the therapy room in the winter morning light with her hand over his and said, that seems like a reasonable want. His jaw moved. The full smile came. The one that was not a ghost of a smile or an almost smile but a real one, complete and brilliant and so rarely seen that it had the effect of sudden sunlight. He said, is that a yes? She said, that is an absolutely yes. He sat back down into the chair and she sat on the arm of it, which was not the most elegant arrangement but was theirs, specifically theirs, and he put his hand around her waist and she leaned against his shoulder and outside the window Seoul went about its winter business, indifferent and loud and alive. The formal declaration came 3 months later. Junwoo requested the presence of his inner circle, his most trusted people, his uncle who had helped him navigate the years after his father's death, his specialist, Mrs. Kwan who was not inner circle in any official capacity but who had been managing his household and his secrets for 8 years and deserved to hear this directly. He introduced Nia as the woman he intended to marry. There were responses that were complicated. There were responses that required his steady voice and his complete certainty. There was one member of the inner circle who said, with a mixture of genuine concern and political calculation, whether this was a considered decision given the various factors involved, and Junwoo looked at the man without hostility or heat and said, every decision I make is considered. This one more than most. His uncle looked at Nia for a long time and then smiled slowly and said, in English, welcome to the family. Mrs. Kwan cried, discreetly, in the direction of the window. The wedding happened in the spring. It was small, deliberately. 40 people in the garden of the Seo estate with the Han River visible over the eastern wall and early blossoms on the trees that Nia had been watching carefully since February, waiting for them. She wore a dress she had helped choose, something that was hers in the way things can be yours when you have stopped trying to be someone else's idea of what you should look like. He wore black, which was entirely expected, with a small white flower at his lapel because she had put it there that morning. He had been working with the specialist for 4 months by then, had graduated from the parallel bars to a single forearm crutch for short distances, and on their wedding day, he walked the length of the garden path under his own power, slowly, carefully, with the fierce concentration of a man who has decided that some moments require you to arrive on your own 2 feet. He stopped in front of her and she saw him trembling slightly with the effort and she reached out and took his hand and felt the trembling stop. The officiant said the words. They said them back. Simple words, true words, the kind that do not need ornamentation because they are sufficient on their own. Afterward there were photographs and dinner and his uncle giving a speech in Korean that Mrs. Kwan quietly translated for her, and the speech was about his father and what he had built and what had been lost and what was being reclaimed now, and in the middle of it Nia looked at Junwoo and he was looking at her with the full clear expression she had learned, the one that had no wall in front of it. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Late that night, when the guests were gone and the garden was quiet and the spring air came through the open windows of the library, they sat together in the warm light of the reading lamp with the Han River doing its usual indifferent thing outside the glass. She was learning Korean seriously now. She had a workbook. He corrected her diligently and with a particular patience that was only ever for her. She got a word right and he said, "Good," and the satisfaction in his voice was completely disproportionate to the achievement, which she found enormously endearing. She said, "I love you," in Korean, with the exact correct pronunciation because she had been practicing that one since November. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it back. In English, because he knew it was hers, and because after a year of careful honest exchange between two people who had both learned the costs of not saying true things, it felt right to say the truest things in the language that required the most precision. "I love you." In the morning she would tell him what she had found out that week, the news that was still quietly settling in her body, the news that made the future feel larger and warmer and more particular than she had imagined even in the most recent months of imagining it. She would tell him over coffee, which they always had together now. She would watch his face change, and she would see the moment he understood what it meant, and she would see the full smile, the real one, and it would undo her the way it always did. But tonight they sat in the library with the spring coming through the windows and his hand over hers on the arm of the chair and her head against his shoulder and everything they had chosen together settling quietly around them like something that had always been true, just waiting for them to arrive at it. He had not spoken for 3 years before she came. Now he could not imagine being quiet.